Jeremy Scahill is author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. He is an award-winning investigative journalist and correspondent for the national radio and TV program Democracy Now! He is also a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute.
Well, thank you all. Is this fine, the microphone? I talk loud in general, so. Yeah, closer, you think? Sorry about that. Luis and I have the same issue, I guess. I first want to say that it is...
contractor problems.
Contractor problems, yes. Blackwater provided the security for the microphones today. You know, when I've been running around the country over the past year talking about Blackwater, I've been approached numerous times by people who sort of say, you know, are you afraid that somebody's going to bump you off? You know, because these guys are, you know, tough guys with guns and stuff. And I've started saying to people when they ask, you know, do you have any protection? I say that my protection is the fact that IVAW is standing against the war. Because you know, with all this talk lately of that 3 a.m. phone call, the members of IVAW understand that the only way we can ensure peace in this world is to have people in office who make it so that 3 a.m. phone calls don't happen. I also want to say I'm incredibly humbled to be here among you and to have been invited to come and join you today. I also want to thank personally the members of IVAW, and I've had a chance to meet many of you over the course of my travels, for being so clear on something that even sectors of the peace movement have been unable to be clear on, and that is that there needs to be an unconditional, immediate withdrawal from Iraq and a payment of reparations to the Iraqi people. The logic of you broke it, you bought it, has a lot of flaws as it's floated by Democratic legislators and some people even identifying themselves as anti-war. What we have is a situation where you stab someone repeatedly over the course of an hour, you leave their body there to die, and then you approach them, you dip a Band-Aid in poison and stick it on them, and you say, things are getting better. This person's going to be cured. That's where what the break it, bought it logic leads to. The reality is that as long as there is 10 or 20 US soldiers in Iraq as an occupation force, there will be the incredible violence suffered by the Iraqi people that we see right now. It will continue to be flypaper for those who want to attack US soldiers. It will continue to give Iran a much greater hand in Iraq. There are very mainstream, to use their phrase, reasons why the United States should not be in Iraq right now. But that's not the focus of what I want to talk to you about today. I've been investigating Blackwater for several years now, and I want to tell you a couple of stories from the recent investigations that I've been doing, not so much focus on what I've been talking about over the past year. And I want to begin with an incident that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It happened on the afternoon of September 16th, 2007 in Baghdad's Nisr Square. A young Iraqi medical student named Haytham al-Rubai, who's 20 years old, was driving his mother, who also was a doctor. They had just dropped off his father, himself a doctor. Medicine was in his DNA. They got into the square that day. They were going to be running some errands, dropping off college applications for his sister. And when they pulled into the square, at the same time that they arrived, a convoy of vehicles approached going the wrong way on a one-way street. I'm sure this story sounds familiar to soldiers who were in Iraq. These vehicles, which were reportedly South African Mamba armored vehicles, entered Nisr Square. They drove the wrong way down a one-way road. Iraqi police scrambled to cut off traffic, as they often have to do, not for the protection of the armored vehicles, but for the protection of Iraqi civilians who may have the lethal misfortune of getting too close to these vehicles. One car was unable to stop quick enough, and one of the gunmen atop the South African Mamba armored vehicle shot a bullet right through the head of the 20-year-old medical student. His car came to a semi-stop, but it was an automatic transmission car, and it kept rolling a bit toward the armored vehicles. His mother was clutching her son's bloodied body. Iraqi policemen ran over to her, and they heard her yelling, my son, and they tried to pull the woman from the car and to stop the vehicle. They saw men in the other armored vehicles aiming their weapons at the vehicle. The Iraqi policemen were yelling at them not to shoot, that they were civilians in the car. And then the men inside of the armored vehicles continued to light up that vehicle, and they blew up the car with the mother inside holding her dead son's body. They launched some kind of projectile at the vehicle, and it engulfed it in flames, and the mother and her son were melded together. Their flesh melted into one another. That was the beginning of a 15-minute shooting spree, during which 17 Iraqi civilians, among them very young children and women, were killed. Several of the Iraqi victims, all of them civilians, were shot as they were running away from the scene or as they sat trapped in their vehicles. The shooters that day in the square were not US soldiers, at least not on active duty, nor were they Iraqi insurgents. They were heavily armed mercenaries who worked for Blackwater USA, recently renamed Blackwater Worldwide. In the aftermath of that 15-minute shooting spree, the Iraqi government was under the mistaken impression that it was sovereign and ordered Blackwater to leave the country. For 3 days, Blackwater stopped escorting US officials in and out of the Green Zone. Their operations were shut down. And what that meant was that the Green Zone was turned into the Green Zoo. Not a single US occupation official that was non-military was able to leave the Green Zone because Blackwater was not guarding them. So central had that force become to US occupation activities. And an indication of how important Blackwater was to the White House at the time, when Condoleezza Rice called Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki ostensibly to apologize, she made it clear to him Blackwater would be going nowhere. The Iraqi government interviewed witnesses, and they issued their repeated demand that Blackwater leave, and then they, just leave it, and then they said that they intended to prosecute the killers as murderers in Iraqi courts. Now, well, hold on a second, that's, yes, if we lived in a just world, and if there was a sovereign Iraqi government, these individuals would have been handed over to the Iraqi courts. But as you all well know, one of Paul Bremer's last acts, the day before he skulked out of Baghdad in June of 2004, was to issue an edict known as Order 17, which granted a sweeping immunity to all contractors from prosecution in Iraqi courts. And he did this at a time when the US was saying they were handing over sovereignty to the Iraqi governments. It's a strange definition of sovereignty to defang a country's legal system or judicial system or court system while at the same time saying, here's your sovereignty. What we saw in the aftermath of Nisour Square was pushback from the White House. Within 3 days, Blackwater was back on the streets of Iraq, armed and dangerous. They remain there to this moment. Their contract is up for automatic renewal in May. Unless someone makes the decision to cancel it, it will be automatically renewed. The State Department began a cover-up of those killings and an attempt to immunize the individual shooters from prosecution on orders from the Bush administration, from the highest levels of power in Washington. I don't have a tremendous amount of time, so I'm going to streamline some of what I was going to talk about with this cover-up. The State Department offered the individuals who did the shooting that day from Blackwater in the Square something called limited use immunity, which is very rarely handed out before you figure out who the guilty parties are. And basically what it said was, you talk to us and nothing you say can or will be used against you in a court of law. That was one of the ways Oliver North got off after Iran-Contra, was because he had been given this immunity, and then later his lawyers argued that prosecutors used that information he provided with his immunity to bring charges against him, and that's how he got off the hook. So the State Department, within hours of this shooting, offers the shooters that limited use immunity. And what that means now is that the FBI, as it investigates it, cannot use any of that information that these individuals gave to bring any charges against them. Now, if you have any faith in the Bush Justice Department's ability or willingness to prosecute politically connected corporations, you probably weren't invited here, and I look forward to your disruption in a few moments. But what we saw was that you have a crime scene where you have 17 civilians that were gunned down, apparently in cold blood, with no provocation whatsoever. The chief law enforcement entity of the United States government is the FBI. They were not sent in to investigate for a full 2 weeks. While that crime scene was contaminated, while witnesses were not taken in for questioning, while the individuals had been granted some form of an immunity. And in fact, when the FBI finally got around to being sent over there, it emerged that Blackwater was actually going to be guarding the investigators for the FBI until Senator Patrick Leahy stood up and said, "This is insane. The accused killers and their friends are going to be guarding the investigators?" You see that this is the reality. You know who guards Nancy Pelosi when she goes over to Iraq? Blackwater. How on earth are we going to have an aggressive congressional investigation against these guys when Congress people go over there and depend on them to stay alive? That's how deep this has cut. But something interesting happened. The Iraqi government did an investigation that was maligned left and right in the press. The corrupt, and I concur with what Luis was saying, the corrupt Iraqi Interior Ministry. And I think there's a lot of reason to be suspicious of what the Iraqi Interior Ministry says. But in this case, what the Iraqis accused Blackwater of doing was corroborated not by the State Department, who employs Blackwater and depends on its mercenaries to keep its forces alive, not by the Bush White House, but by the US military. The Army sent investigators there almost immediately. In fact, they were there within 12 minutes of the first death that happened in the square that day. They investigated it. And what the US military determined, and this got almost no publicity whatsoever except for one story in the Washington Post, is that all 17 of those Iraqis were killed as a result of unjustified and unprovoked fire, and they said that it was criminal conduct. That was the military investigation. When the FBI, and what the military did, what the Bush White House and its State Department should have done immediately, they interviewed Iraqi witnesses. They interviewed Iraqi police officers on the scene. They interviewed people who themselves had been shot. They interviewed some of the individuals who had taken part in the melee that day. We also discovered that apparently one Blackwater officer was so horrified, Blackwater mercenary was so horrified at what was happening that he turned his own weapon on another Blackwater guy and told him to cease fire. That's how out of control it had gotten. So the military does its investigation. The FBI finally gets over there, and I was very skeptical of what the FBI was going to find. But what was incredible is that the FBI leaked some of its findings to the New York Times, and we understand that the FBI says that 14 of those 17 deaths were as a result of unjustified and unprovoked fire. The military in return said that the FBI was being too generous to Blackwater. And so what happens now? Where are the individuals who gunned down these 17 people? They're walking around as free people. They'll never be handed over to the Iraqi legal system, and they may never be prosecuted in this country, because the laws on the books right now in the United States are such that if you're a soldier and you murder someone in Iraq, you could be court-martialed, clear as could be. There have been at least 64 murder-related courts-martial in Iraq. I think the number is probably much greater now, which I think is shockingly low. I think that there's been a lot more murder in Iraq by US soldiers, and it needs to be prosecuted. Not a single armed contractor has ever been prosecuted for any crimes in Iraq whatsoever. Not jaywalking, not murder, not torture. Only 2 contractors of the hundreds of thousands that have gone in and out of there over the course of 5 years have ever been charged with any crime. One of them was an individual who pled guilty to possession of child pornography images on his computer at Abu Ghraib prison. How about the contractors who have participated in the torture at Abu Ghraib prison? This guy goes down for having porno images on his computer, a moral crime in the eyes of the Bush administration. And then you have another prosecution of an individual who allegedly stabbed a coworker in a kitchen, a KBR person. That represents the entirety of prosecution of the private army that the Bush administration has deployed in Iraq. Blackwater is not the biggest of these companies. It's not even the most profitable. It's sort of like a high-end boutique on a strip full of Walmarts. It's the Maserati of the industry. But right now in Iraq, as Luis said, you have somewhere between 150 and 160,000 US soldiers who wear the United States flag. You have 182,000 private contractors, and that doesn't even count the armed ones. They work for 630 corporations on the US government payroll. They draw personnel from 100 countries around the world. In addition to that, you have 170 mercenary firms operating in Iraq. I want to repeat that. There are 170 companies that provide services like Blackwater's in Iraq right now. That's almost as many nations as there are registered at the UN. What does that say about the discussion that we, all of us, I think, have about Iraq being a model? You know, the role of the US military in Iraq, one of the main roles that the US military has played in Iraq has been to ensure that US war corporations make a killing off of that war. And KBR provides poisoned water to the troops. They don't even take care of the people that they're using to make their killing in Iraq. And you know, Blackwater has taken in $1 billion in security contracts just in Iraq. That doesn't count their work in Afghanistan or the 50,000 US personnel they train a year at their private military base in Moyac, North Carolina. This has not just been about looting Iraq or taking Iraq's oil. It's also about looting the US Treasury. It's about undermining US democratic processes. Why has the Bush administration elected to use this army of private contractors? Others on this panel have alluded to it, but I think it boils down to a couple of very basic reasons. This administration does not want to implement a draft because it would make the Iraq war politically untenable very, very fast. They don't want to deal with the messy process of parliamentary democracies in countries around the world whose citizens are opposed to the Iraq invasion in order to coerce or co-opt them into participation in the occupation, or in that case, the invasion of Iraq. And so what they've done is they have rented an army. They've built a coalition, not of the willing, but of the billing, to go in and occupy Iraq. This is a subversion of the not only will of the American people now, who are pretty clearly against this war, the will of the Iraqi people, over 70% of whom want an immediate end to the occupation, but it's a subversion of the sovereignty of the nations, of those 100 countries around the world who have personnel deployed working for this rented army in Iraq. I understand I have to wrap up here. I got to about a fraction of what I wanted to say, but I want to wrap up by talking about something that I think is of crucial importance right now, and that is looking at the election campaign in the context of what's happening right now in Iraq. The role of people who want an end to the war in Iraq, an end to the occupation of Iraq, is not to drink the Kool-Aid of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. John McCain, of course, wants U.S. troops to be in Iraq until they're all as old as he is. But we have something that's deadly serious right now, and I think that so many people are wrapped up in the fainting spells and the mesmerizing state of mind that we all are familiar with now, that they forget 1 million Iraqis have died since the beginning of this war that wouldn't have otherwise died as the beginning of the occupation. It's a consistent U.S. policy. And the reality is, and I've been investigating this recently, neither Barack Obama nor Hillary Clinton have any intention of ending the occupation of Iraq. They both have plans to keep anywhere between 40 and 80,000 troops in Iraq. That's not to count the contractors who operate now at a more than 1-to-1 ratio. And they say they're going to keep the green zone in place, the Baghdad airport, the U.S. Embassy, which is the largest in world history. Anyone who is in the military, and I think we have a lot in this room right now, knows that those things don't exist in a vacuum. You have to run supply lines. You have to have cargo planes coming in. You have to have your forces protected. You have to have your forces supplied. So we're talking about potentially 120 to 150,000 U.S. paid personnel remaining in Iraq under a plan that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton say is a plan to end the war or end the occupation. And I'm not here to say to you, don't vote for these people, or you should go vote for someone else. What I'm here to say on this issue is that the individuals in this room who served in Iraq and Afghanistan have a unique credibility that I don't have in talking about this. And perhaps the most important thing we could do right now, and I think it's a good thing that Hillary Clinton is still in the race, because then it's not just a giveaway. We have a moment where pressure can be applied. And I think it's so important to push them now, not in November, not wishful thinking that something good's going to happen down the line, but to get them to back off of their continuation occupation plans, back away from it, and support immediate, unconditional withdrawal. The last thing I'm going to say is this. The last thing I'm going to say is this. If there's one thing that the Democrats have shown themselves capable of doing, it's losing very important elections and then blowing it once they've won. The Congress under Nancy Pelosi has been shameful on the issue of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The fact that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both want to put more troops in Afghanistan, want to increase the size of the military by 90,000 troops, speaks volumes to the state of politics right now. Ending a war of this magnitude can be done very quickly if it's the #1 international priority of those in power. And we need to realize that we are not defined in times where we like somebody that's running for office. In fact, this is probably the most important moment in our lives when it comes to what is the direction of our country going to be. And we should never, and this is it for me, this is what I'm going to say, we should never, ever cede our conscience to those in power because we think that lesser of two evils is somehow just. It is so dire, the stakes that we have right now in the world, and all of you who are veterans and were in Iraq and in Afghanistan are the leaders of a movement that is going to continue to grow. And it is you who are going to change the face of this nation, who are going to stand up for those who have been victimized in Iraq, and those who are going to put this country on a path toward reconciliation and a just policy. Thank you.